I'm now very pleased to introduce Tony Coelho, who will be serving as the moderator for this morning's second panel. Mr. Coelho is a former congressman from California who represented the state for 12 years and actually served as the House Majority Whip for his final 2 terms. During his time in Congress, he was actually the primary author and sponsor of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And since 2009, Congressman Coelho, once a congressman, always a congressman, has served as chairperson for the Partnership to Improve Patient Care, an organization that is working to amplify the patient's voice in various disease areas, as well as improve how patients are diagnosed, treated, and cared for. Therefore, I think you'll agree that Congressman Coelho is the ideal person to moderate the second session, and I think he would probably readily admit that he would much prefer to be here today than on the campaign trail with 3 weeks to go in California. So, thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. First off, I want to say that I'm sort of embarrassed not to have the knowledge and the expertise that so many of you have. And I want to thank all of you for the role that you play to improve patient care. It's obviously, that's really what I've always been about, so it's great to be in a room with so many people who have done so much. I also want to thank the conveners of the conference for putting all this together. It's so far a spectacular event, and I'm sure all of you will get a lot out of it before the end of the day. I was honored to be asked to moderate this panel discussion. As a person with epilepsy, I've been preaching about patient-centeredness for a long time. I've had seizures for 50 years and continue to have them. When we wrote the Americans with Disabilities Act during my time in Congress, our goal was to empower patients with disabilities to continue working and living by having appropriate accommodations to do so. And now we're talking about changing the culture of our healthcare system to allow patients to actively participate in their healthcare decision making. Some people would say that's a novel idea. For PIPSI, patient-centeredness revolves around 3 key themes: giving a voice to patients, giving a choice to patients, and advancing value for patients. Patients have a voice when they're educated about their health status and treatment options, and are able to articulate their preferences related to the impact of treatments on their quality of life. That voice has meaning when they have real, accessible choices for their treatment. With good information, patients can assess the value of treatment options for themselves. And I would emphasize that value to one patient will differ from value to another patient. Value assessments are very personal. And I propose that given patients tool to assess value for themselves is both effective in the context of improving health outcomes and for long-term costs. There is plenty of evidence that patients active in their health care also better adhere to their treatments and therefore are less costly in the long run. I am pleased to introduce our 3 panelists today who will speak to the real-life tactics for advancing patient-centered research and care. I will introduce all 3 and then provide each of them with a few minutes to talk about the work that they do and are doing. First, we have Dr. Amy Abernathy, who is a hematologist, oncologist, and palliative, is that right?
Palliative.
Okay, physician. She is also a professor of medicine in the Duke University School of Medicine, director of Duke Center for Learning Healthcare in the Duke Clinical Research Institute, and director of the Duke Cancer Care Research Program in the Duke Cancer Institute. With over 375 publications, she is internationally recognized expert in health services research, comparative effectiveness research, patient-reported outcomes, clinical informatics, and patient-centered care. In addition to her role at Duke, Dr. Abernathy is the Chief Medical Officer at Flatiron Health, a health technology company focused on organizing the world's cancer data and making it useful for patients, clinicians, researchers, payers, and policymakers. She also chairs the PRO Task Force for PCORI's National Clinical Research Network. Then we have Dr. Leonard Lichtenfeld. He is a board-certified medical oncologist and internist who was a practicing physician for over 19 years. He is currently the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the American Cancer Society. Among his responsibilities is directing the Society's Cancer Control Science Department. This group of internationally recognized experts focuses on the prevention and early detection of cancer, as well as emerging science and trends in cancer. In addition, Dr. Lichtenfeld oversees the Society's cancer control programs and health disparities, global health, and preventive health partnership with the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association. Then we have Linda House. Linda joined the organization called Cancer Support Community in February of 2012 as Executive Vice President of External Affairs, where she oversees the development, marketing and communications and public policy efforts of the national organization. Linda joined CSC with nearly 30 years of experience working in the cancer care environment, several of them being direct patient care in the acute oncology and the hospice care setting. Linda also serves in a variety of advisory roles in the national cancer community. Next we have Dr. Paul Klutz, who is a certified medical oncologist and internist, who is currently serving as acting Deputy Office Director for the Office of Hematology and Oncology Products at the FDA. He is focused on, and here's another one, he is focused on gerontology. Is that close?
Genitourinary.
Okay. Not close. Oncology drug development, and currently serves as the FDA Prostate Cancer Scientific Liaison. Prior to the FDA, he completed a medical oncology fellowship at the National Cancer Institute. Among his primary interests are the opportunities and challenges associated with patient-reported outcomes data. I would like to ask the panel to begin by discussing changes needed in order to move the patient-centric healthcare system beyond clinical trials. For instance, what role do patients currently have in cancer research and care? How should that role evolve to deliver more value for patients themselves and the broader ecosystem, including improving patient education about their disease, to better facilitate appropriate shared decision-making between patients and providers? How do we account for individual patient preferences into tools for decision-making and value assessment? What payment reforms are needed to incentivize patient-centric approaches to research and clinical care? And Amy, why don't we start with you?
Perfect. Hi, I'm Amy Abernathy. I'm going to start with a preamble and then get into some specifics that I think would be helpful. In terms of that preamble in the last session, we heard about the importance of pushing towards a learning health system where clinical care and research and the activities of getting towards innovation in cancer are really better approximated through data, process, learning, and partnership of all of us working together. Another message that's coming through loud and clear is the importance of patient advocates, patient groups, and ourselves as society as partners in this process. But I'd also like to highlight that as we think about all the different kinds of people in the room, FDA is on my left, American Cancer Society on my right, it's actually all parts of the community working together is going to be important in order to push forward value and innovation in cancer. And I think that's also highly relevant as we think about getting the patient at the center of the process. In terms of some key tactical things that we need to focus on, I always think about this concept of stitching the patient voice into the center of the process and making sure that we encapsulate and understand value and outcomes from the patient perspective. What might that look like? Well, we sort of have this language, patient-reported outcomes, really bubbling up from many different directions. But patient-reported outcomes, symptoms, quality of life may not really be the full spectrum of creating the patient story and making sure it's at the center of what we do. We need to make sure that we're collecting patient-generated data of all types, not just quality of life and symptoms, but also personal values, expectations of care, and also what happened in satisfaction. We need to be able to collect information such as the patient-generated biosensor data, their Fitbits that you wear at home, and other kinds of information that helps to tell the full story. As a data person, I recognize that not all of these variables are as reliable at all times as we would like them to be for research and other purposes, but the more that we actually collect and understand and use this information, the better off we are going to be in ensuring that the full gamut of the patient experience is a part of the system. One of the things that we've been looking at is how do we incorporate the patient voice through patient-reported outcomes, the patient experience through patient-generated data of all types into big data sets and into the overarching data structure. And I think we've had some important starting points, including things like ensuring that we have patient portals and EHRs, but we have a long way to go. In Meaningful Use 3, we need to include patient-reported outcomes, and we need to make sure that we are using Meaningful Use 3 as a way of ensuring bidirectional communication with the patient and also bidirectional communication across health systems in order to help make our data flow. We need to make sure that as we do this, we're developing better and better systems and processes that get back to what patients need. I shouldn't just collect patient data, but use the data that gets collected to meaningfully drive things that patients need. For example, if I learn that this person's having problems with sleep, why not better teach about sleep at that moment in time and self-management of sleep? Use the data to work for patients at the same time people are collecting information. And finally, one of the things that we need to do is help patients define value for us. We've defined value in many different ways all across the system without necessarily always including the patient voice, and we need to do that better as we start having this conversation across society. So I'll stop there, and then I've got a lot of other nuggets we can talk about next time.
Thank you, Amy. Lindo, you want to take that comment that Amy's been talking about and develop it? I mean, one of the concerns that I have is a lot of the discussion this morning was about what we're doing for patients, and I'd like to hear how do we get the patients more involved working with patients, and patient-centeredness should mean patients making some decisions and so forth. So I'd like to get your perspective on that, please.
Yep, sure. And just to ground us in who the cancer support community is, because I think it's really important. So we're an organization that's 30 years old, and we were founded in evidence. So we are all research-based. We touch about 1 million patients in a year, but we have our own research and training institute in Philadelphia, really driving true patient voice research in their experience with cancer. And through that, we have a cancer experience registry that has 7,300 patients and growing as a part of the registry. We've invested almost $2 million into stress screening, so we're understanding better what really raises issues for patients, and more importantly, how can we influence that before they advance to a point where they might have a clinical diagnosis of depression or anxiety. And we invest about $50 million in direct patient services through a network of 170 locations throughout the United States. So, you know, what I'm bringing to you today is not my opinion, it's the opinion of the patients that we serve and the research that we drive. So with that sort of backdrop, a couple of things that have been striking to me in today's conversation, and also, you know, conversations that we've had over the last few weeks, and particularly the 60 Minutes segment, since that was raised by someone else, that I think is a real problem for us. We talk about what we do for patients, you know, and we've talked in the back of the room, and let me say as a backdrop as well, not for a second do I think that we're not trying to do the best thing we can do for patients, right? There is no one in this room who isn't thinking about patients every single day. But where there's a little bit of a disconnect is we're talking about what are we doing for patients versus what are we doing with patients. And even in the 60 Minutes segment, the comment was made that it's our duty to protect our patients. Well, it's your duty to engage our patients. You know, it's not necessarily you protecting them. And patients own a part of that. You know, what we do is we try to do two things. We try to influence the environment to say, how do you work with patients? And then we try to say to patients, how can you help yourself? So we have, in fact, in addition to the Cancer Experience Registry, collecting and better understanding what that is and how can we help patients better, we've created tools that help them engage in this process. So we have a treatment decision counseling model. So if they see their physician and they don't really understand it, how can we influence that better? In that particular model, patients that go through that, 12% go on a clinical trial. So we're moving the needle around that. Patients are reporting that they have a better understanding of their treatment options, and which is important because on the flip side of that, we will be releasing data, the first year's registry data, on October 22nd in Philadelphia, and you're all invited to come to that. But even in patients that are highly educated, and these are CML patients who are on treatment for a long period of time, 62% of those in our registry, and we're talking about almost 600 patients, report that they're not prepared to make treatment decisions. 62% aren't prepared to make treatment decisions. Yet these are people that are living with a heavy burden around treatment decisions. And those burdens go beyond a side effect profile, right? 50% are depleting their savings account, 50% are foregoing activities with their family, 70% are experiencing fatigue that's debilitating to them, 50% are decreasing their work life. So it's pretty significant, and the time to really shift that, how are we working with patients, is now, because the patients are the ones that are left with the collateral damage.
Give the example that you gave me about the woman who couldn't tell what her real interest was.
Yeah. So again, part of the point of our work is to help patients understand that they own a big piece of this. And one of the examples that we have that is striking, a woman who went through our open to options process had already seen her physician, treatment plan already established for this woman. What she didn't tell her physician, which I think is so important because patients aren't telling you these things, what she didn't tell her physician is she knew that she was going to die from her cancer. She had a stage 4 aggressive cancer. She is a classically trained pianist, and all she really cared about was playing the piano until the day she died. So having that conversation led her back to the physician to say, this is really all I care about. Extend my life to the degree that I can have quality, and oh, by the way, I need to play the piano for however long that period of time is.
Lynn, from your point of view with this discussion, PCORI was set up to include patients in the decision-making process. And I don't know if that's been effective or not. I have my own thoughts about that. But give us, from your perspective, of what you think patient-centeredness should be, and some of the examples that have been discussed already, your comments on those.
Well, it's actually an interesting topic, and I'll share with the audience that I come at it from a variety of different perspectives. Yes, I'm Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the American Cancer Society, but I've been engaged in other activities surrounding the medical profession and medical practice for a number of years. And I don't mean to pick on Paul. I promised him when we sat down here, and I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm from the FDA, and I'm in Washington, and he's here to help me."
Appropriately seated.
But I said to him, I said, "Well, you're part of the good guys, so I'm not going to be. But here I'm not. Now I'm going to pick on you a little bit." As you may know, and I'm not intimately involved, but the FDA has actually been charged as part of legislation to engage patient-reported outcomes. And I will share that when I first saw how that was being structured, I was a little bit disappointed in what I saw. This has been now for a year and a half, 2 years, whatever. And I don't blame the FDA for that, because I think that this is still something that's under construction. We've heard here today from a number of panelists about the problems not only of engaging the patients and the cost of engaging patients, but what does it really mean, how do we measure it, and how do we put value on that. So I think as a concept, it's an important concept. I think in practicality and articulating it, I think it's going to be more difficult. And Linda, you mentioned about the college-educated person who still doesn't know how to engage. I'm a college-educated person. I'm a knowledgeable consumer. I've had cancer, but the skin cancers that were somewhat complicated, but nonetheless not a very serious one. But I have been a patient in other settings, and let me tell you, as a physician who's been a patient, it's an overwhelming process even without cancer, because you cannot navigate that system. I mean, I did finally have to sort of take charge, and it's not important here in this discussion, but I've written about it. Sometimes you have to take charge. One of the other implications of that, by the way, is that mortality in this country from all causes, interestingly enough, is it could be reduced 40%. 40% if the health habits of the least educated were the same as the most educated. And the difference simply is a matter of knowledge, engagement, and empowerment. I'll close by saying that I've been involved in the committee that initially wrote the documents that led to the patient-centered medical home, not specifically a cancer-related, now becoming a cancer-related phenomenon. And everybody sat around and says, we know what the medical home was. And I said, no, I don't think we do. And I was sort of put off to the side a little bit because it was challenging the concept that was going to lead to this market improvement. And here we are a number of years later, I think about 7 or 8 years later from the time of those first thought papers came out. And I would say we have medical homes, but if you've seen one, the standard phrase is, if you've seen one, you've seen one. So the question is, we talk patient engagement, we talk patient-centeredness, but what we're ignoring is the fact that we're not accomplishing patient-centeredness. I sat in I'm going to say one more thing. I sat in a meeting yesterday in Atlanta talking about palliative care. We have a strong interest in palliative care, and for your benefit, Tony, since it may be a new phrase for you, and for others in the room, it really is an engagement of patients in those life issues from the beginning of their care, not at the end of their care. So it's a matter of having the counseling and having the services, and of course Amy is a palliative care physician as she was introduced, having those services available, but also having those conversations, getting to the key point, what do you want to do? And we're having an increasing difficulty, and if you talk to physicians and you talk to patients, you talk to support staff, we're still having great difficulty having those conversations. Yes, there are obviously some, perhaps hopefully many who do it, but we still have many people who don't have the opportunity to have those conversations, to set those goals. And a long time ago, when I still had normal colored hair, long time ago, we didn't
it's normal.
We didn't have much, we didn't have much to offer. We didn't have much to offer, so we could have conversations, and I would say to patients, I can give you this drug, in the case 5FU comes to mind, or some breast cancer treatment, but I'm not sure I can improve the quality of life you have today. And in a sense, we sometimes maybe we need to have some of those conversations today, and that's not the conversation that a lot of folks are having.
Thank you, Lynn. Paul, you represent the government here on this panel. And there's been a lot of discussion about our NIH, everybody, FDA, is sort of treats the patient as somebody you tell what to do, as opposed to considering them as an asset that should be considered and so forth. Those of us in the patient side really feel strongly about that, and today a lot of people feel that way about government in general. But for our discussion, what is FDA doing to change that perception, to do like the legislation says, to get patients more involved? What are you doing to change that, and how do you do it?
Well, I'm not going to speak for the entire government.
No, I'm asking you to speak for FDA.
And even for the entire FDA, but what I'll say is that I would have to disagree a bit that government institutions like the NIH, for instance, or the FDA have not been putting a lot more effort into patient-centered drug development. A lot of the institutions that are forward-thinking, I think, are centered actually in the NIH, the PRO CTCAE effort. A lot of the funding towards patient-reported outcomes is being generated through the government. But to speak specifically to the FDA, I don't think there's ever been a time where there's been more FDA interaction with patients. And I can talk to many of the patient advocates, some of which are here, including Cindy, who I recently co-wrote a paper with that will come out in JNCI about what is going on with patient-reported outcomes in oncology, what are the hurdles. And it's actually a very open paper that discusses each stakeholder's frustrations, from industry, from patient advocacy, from the academic groups, and from the FDA in one single paper, and then, just not to be a squeaky wheel, at the end we come up with some forward-thinking ideas on how to move forward. And so in oncology, the way I started to get interested in patient-reported outcomes is as a prostate cancer reviewer, I kept seeing multiple large randomized controlled clinical trials with overall survival primary endpoints. Now remember, in prostate cancer, just 10 years ago, we had nothing with an overall survival benefit, and now today we have 6 therapies spanning different mechanisms of action that improve median overall survival. But like most metastatic solid tumors, these aren't curing patients. These are moving the time of death back by on an order of 2 to maybe 6 months. Incremental, but as anyone who's done oncology research over the last 20 or 30 years can tell you, meeting an overall survival benefit at all is actually very difficult to do and shows you something about the benefit of the drug. That said, after I reviewed 3 large randomized clinical trials for these agents, I noticed that there were some patient-reported outcomes integrated in these clinical trials, but they were integrated in what I thought was not a very thoughtful way. They were not upfront in what the important objectives of the trial were. And I'm not pointing fingers. I just think that was the culture at the time, 5-6 years ago, when these trials began. But that got me interested. And so now, over the last 2 years, as I look back in my Outlook calendar to see what I've been doing at meetings, I realized that the last 6 or 7 large meetings really centered around patient-reported outcomes or talking with patient advocates. 2 Brookings meetings with academics and industry on patient-reported outcomes, getting into the weeds about why is it not getting into labels, what is the problem with patient-reported outcomes, and how can we move forward. We had, at AACR meeting, I met with several patient advocates from my particular disease interest, prostate cancer. And at ASCO, we had a closed-door international regulatory meeting with over 75 international patient advocates and 5 regulatory agencies across the world. Open discussion. It was very interesting and very eye-opening. And so there's no doubt that patient-reported outcomes is very important to all the stakeholders, but talk is cheap. So what are we going to do to actually get some credible data on what patients are experiencing during clinical trials? And that's really where the challenge lies, because no one is arguing that the concept of pain or the concept of nausea or fatigue or a functional measure is important to everybody. Physicians to make decisions, patients to make decisions, regulators to better assess the risk-benefit, and payers. But I don't think it's in anyone's interest to have unreliable or very noisy data where you can't be sure of the effect, and you definitely can't be sure of the magnitude of the effect. And so what we've been working on, and I think we've gone some ways to getting some solutions, is to look at questions like, how do open-label trials affect patient-reported outcomes data? Because most of our oncology trials are open-label. That means everyone knows what they're getting. And if you know you're getting the really fabulous drug, is that going to affect what you report? Maybe. I don't know. No one's told me what the data is on what that effect is. And I put that out to the academic folks at Brookings to start to look at. How about missing data? If you stop recording your patient-reported outcomes instrument questionnaire during the clinical trial, is that just random between the 2 arms, or is that because that tells you something about the patient? Are they in the hospital? Are they just so sick that they don't care? Or are they doing so well that they're out playing tennis? I don't know. But it's probably informative, and therefore informative censoring. We have to figure out what the effect of that is and how to best mitigate it. So I'm going to end on a note of optimism, because there's a lot going on in patient-reported outcomes, and there's a lot more engagement with patients from the FDA, from industry that I've seen, and from academics than there has probably ever been, although I've not been around quite as long as some of you guys out there, no offense.
Thanks a lot.
I don't know it that way.
But the other optimistic point is that we're not just talking about it. We're doing actionable things. We're trying to get involved with sponsors early on in clinical development to say, what's the patient feeling? Are there any functional or symptomatic things that you can measure? Is there an instrument that's been developed that we feel comfortable with? And if not, let's try to develop one. And let's get them in trials now, because unlike most people here, our decisions are now. When it comes to the FDA, we don't have the time to say, you know, this is interesting, but we really can't make a decision right now. No. We have a timeline that a decision must be made on a drug approval or non-approval. We have a timeline on when we have to agree to a clinical trial design. So we have to make these decisions. And I think to Amy's point, nothing is going to be perfect. There's going to be limitations to every single thing we measure. It's just our job to mitigate the limitations and make it as good as it can be.
Anybody have any questions of any of the panelists of what has been said? Glenn?
I would like to expand just for a moment, and I know it's not on topic, so I'll keep it short. Patient-reported outcomes in cancer care have a lot more than just the drug issue. It has to do with many of the things that we do. So 2 things come to mind very quickly. The entire PSA debate. PSA leads to treatment. Treatment leads to surgery. And I don't, without going into detail, surgery can lead to side effects, or radiation can lead to side effects, and we do not have that kind of longitudinal data. And proton beam therapy, for example, I was part of it. I wasn't part of it. I watched it. I wrote it up publicly, so there's nothing here. I called it a scrum, a Twitter chat, where there was high level of advocacy on behalf of proton beam, no bounce in terms of the toxicities and side effects. So when we talk in the larger picture, and Lee talked earlier as a representative from the insurance side, but I think we all have to be concerned that this patient-reported outcome issue is not just limited to the somewhat, but not very narrow focus of the drugs. It really goes to a lot of things that we do in clinical medicine for cancer patients, so we need to pay attention to that.
Linda?
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up because I think clinical trials is a perfect place to solve some of the challenges that we have, and particularly in this value conversation. And, you know, I think about this a lot, especially because I'm hearing, we've got a couple of projects going where we're asking patients to define value in their cancer experience. And so as I'm reading those responses and hearing from patients, I really struggle with the equation that we've established around value today, right? Efficacy over cost equals something, you know, whatever that is. And, you know, I think about 5 elements that in a perfect world I would love to see as a part of this value equation. And I think some of this stuff can be collected in the clinical trial. It will be hard, and there still needs to be some work and thought around it. But I think about efficacy being one of them. I think about tolerability being one of them. I think about overall cost. So not just the cost of an intervention, but what is the overall cost? Is a patient coming in once a week? Is the patient coming in once a month? What does that mean to the patient who might have to take off work? Gas, transportation, all of those costs, more than just a price tag for one intervention. I think about overall quality of life. So not just tolerability of the intervention, but what is the overall quality of life? Again, am I having to take off work? Am I missing time with my family? And then the 5th piece of that, which I think would be really interesting to collect, is a patient satisfaction score. And that's where we could do that in the clinical trial. It's hard for us to go back and say, oh, patients, you've received XYZ. How did you feel about that experience? Where in fact that could be something that we could collect as the clinical trial in the clinical trial process, so that as you're looking at an approval or non-approval of drug, device, whatever it is, there is some element of, but this is what happened to the patient during that. So I think as we continue to talk about, you know, value and experience, that there is this level of technicolor that we have to add to data, right? And you can have them both, but it's hard. It's hard.
Amy?
Can I just expand on that? And one of the things that's important is when we think about personal experience, like Linda's saying, we can really expand on our understanding of the clinical experience, personal experience within the context of the clinical trial. But we need to remember also that that personal experience is important all the way across care. And so part of the blocking and tackling and hard work that we need to figure out is how do we make it so that we systematically collect the patient information about the patient experience within the context of routine clinical care. And that means we've actually got to partner all across the community of oncology, which is not just academic settings, but academic and community settings. And we actually have to rethink how we organize ourselves so that the process of collecting and understanding the patient experience doesn't get in the way of care, but actually facilitates care. And you know, we've studied this a lot, and at the end of the day, it's a lot of micro details that ultimately lead back up to the macro understanding of how do you have complete and reliable information. But it really first requires a high-level meta thinking that we have to systematically collect this information, because it's also part of observing what happens to drugs and other non-drug treatments in cancer past the time of adoption.
Yeah, I would just make one caution. Something that I've seen digging into the data a little bit, especially in prostate cancer, is there's this concept called saturation in patient-reported outcome research, which I'm sure Amy knows a lot about, where you ask patients what's important to you for a specific concept, and it might be very narrow, like pain, or it might be very not narrow, like quality of life. And when you ask a patient what their quality of life is, everybody's going to have something a little bit different to say. And this idea of saturating means you get every single variable that's important to every single person, and then you try to hone that down. So there's an issue with respect, one more research issue with respect to patient-reported outcomes, and that is, what's the burden? What's the acceptable number of questions you can possibly ask a patient who's not feeling terribly good once every month for a long time? Because that's going to play into missing data, and that's going to play into sloppy data. Because if I don't know about you guys, but when I fill out a questionnaire, and if it's even more than like 15, I'm just like, I mean, you're not thinking about the questions as carefully as you need to. So we have to just, in some ways, at least, what I'd like to see in cancer clinical trials is a nice narrow disease symptom score. What kind of disease symptoms are you feeling at baseline? How is that improving? A nice narrow treatment toxicity based symptoms. What's the most important symptoms to the patient on the active arm and on the control arm? No cherry picking, because if you just look at the control arm's toxicities and you're not getting that drug, well, you're not going to have as many as they do. So no cherry picking. I'd love to see some kind of functional, either PRO or even more interesting potentially if we can get it validated as some kind of Fitbit type of thing where that actually reduces the burden though. You know, right? They're not answering questions, you're just sort of tracking them, which is interesting. And then finally, do we need 60 items, 60 questions to get a read on someone's health-related quality of life? Someone needs to show me the data that does any better than one single 0 to 10 question that says, how you feeling? And in fact, there is some data, way old, from 1998 by Sloan that suggests that actually it measures up relatively similarly to these large instruments. And so, you know, these are in the weeds, but these are just some things to consider with respect to getting better patient-reported outcome data.
Linda, you probably disagree with the 10 as opposed to 80 questions.
I don't disagree with that. I'll tell you, I don't disagree with it completely, but we have data that would demonstrate the opposite, especially in the cancer patient experience. And
that they'll continue to fill them out.
They'll continue to fill. So in our cancer experience registry, some of the patients are completing almost 200 questions to share with us their experience. Lynn, we have, you know, you and I we'll tweet each other
friends,
about
folks.
this. We are.
Hear that deep breath.
We have a 70% completion rate in our sub-registries.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Of the people who fill out the question, what's their educational level?
I can get you that data. It's a little bit on the higher end. It's
going to be on the higher end.
It is.
And
I actually have it in my bag. I can tell you exactly. I just don't remember.
You know, no, and I'm not. Yeah. Believe me, I'm not. I don't mean to. I guess I do.
Sure, you do.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, you do. It's all right.
I spend my day in a town in South Georgia that is part of an economically depressed, educationally, socioeconomically depressed area, of which there are a lot in the Southeast. And to fill out a 200-page questionnaire.
Question, not 200 page.
Well, not 200 questions. I'm sorry, 200 pages. And there are two things that I'm thinking about here as I'm sitting, and that's actually, I'll blame Lee Newcomer for this one as well. When you get a satisfaction questionnaire from Delta, which is the one you fill out? It's the one that you don't like. You'll take the time to fill that 15 questions out. I'm not being critical, I'm just saying these are the real life things that happen. When you go on to Yelp or you go to TripAdvisor, how do you determine whether somebody's satisfaction level of a 5 rating is the same as your satisfaction? And Paul, you were pointing that out. And the final thing were some comments that were made at ASCO about the impact of social media on clinical trials, that the patients are a lot smarter than the doctors. And the patients are actually doing this already. And they're finding each other through various social media mechanisms and comparing notes on which side effect they have. Now, that was not scientific data, they admitted it, but it says certainly was an interesting issue for discussion, and people who follow social media in cancer have seen that phenomenon already happen. So,
Amy, you want to get into this?
And I want to finish my thought before Lynn interrupted me. Because,
I'm sorry.
So, you know, we've actually studied the number of items ad nauseum, to the point that you guys really don't want to look at how much we've studied this. But let me tell you a couple of things that we've observed. We've observed, and patients in many patient surveys have told us, and we look at this every single visit, so it's not once a month, it's each time you come into the clinic. It's not by socioeconomic demographic, except for who comes into a series of 35 different clinics across the country, but it's, you know, all ages and all races. And what we found is the biggest predictor is whether or not your doctor said, I looked at your report, or I looked at the information, and then took it from there. So that really the feedback loop is the predominant decider as to whether or not this information is important for me to complete the next time I come in the door. And if it's 10 items or 80 items or 200 items, if those items are not ultimately connected back to the feedback loop of taking care of me, then people really do decrease their interest in participation over time. But when the feedback loop is clean, which we've actually practiced by teaching doctors to say, I looked at your report and, we then hung up signs all across the clinic, did you remember to say? And those words actually became the key feature and driving force. So the only reason I want to bring this up is because we spend a lot of time getting worried about the number of items, and from a reliability and validity standpoint, we do need to think about what's the right thing to get to the precise estimate. But the real question is for patients, what makes a difference to me when I'm sitting there with my doctor?
Amy, can I ask a quick question? Did that data make it out to CROs and to industry as far as using that as in educating their sites with respect to decreasing missingness? Because that sounds interesting.
So, we've published this quite a bit. We have spent time, we have actually an entire cooperative group, NIH funded, where this is the underlying premise of the Clinical Research Network. It's the Palliative Care Research Cooperative Group. And the entire cooperative group is based on patient-reported outcomes. It's part of what we do in PCORNet's PRO task force. I can tell you that we've taught CRAs, so monitors, medical monitors for a number of drug companies as well as CROs, and they say things like, the doctors don't want to talk to me. That's not my role in the clinic. I don't have time for that. And my argument often is, let's first sort of think about what it is that we need to be doing and how do we work our way through it. And one of the other kind of just hopefully short observations about all this is that at the end of the day, many of these details are often the parts that feel hard. It seems easy to hand out the paper survey and then be done with it. But actually to really rethink, what does care look like and how do I effectively slot in while respecting people's time and what it is that they're there to do is the real question.
Well, I think part of it also is that culture issue where investigators, because they don't think it's important to the clinical trial, what's really important is that they ask what the toxicities have been, and they are monitoring for the radiographic change, and they're looking at their overall survival. That maybe that culture is not yet inculcated into the investigator community that, hey, this is important, it's becoming more and more important. And at all of these different meetings that I've been to, it's just the same story with everybody saying these data are going to be looked at, and therefore if they are going to be looked at, it's imperative that we do it as cleanly and as best as possible. And to that point, with the whole 200 versus 50 versus 20 items, I still don't think just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. It's always
can I address that, right?
Because I think this is now, because
right.
she's been interrupted
I've been
now.
patiently waiting, right, to say, I'm going to tell you what's really happening, right? We can sit here and say, I don't complete a survey, or when I do the Delta survey, or whatever. Let me tell you what's happening from patients, okay? Number one, we have a 67% completion rate for patients in our sub-registries, and those are registries that push almost 200 questions, 67% completion rate. And we do take those out to the community. We have offices, 5 offices in LA, got an office in Miami, Lauderdale, Philly, so we're reaching underserved populations as best as we can. We have one in Atlanta. Please come. I'll come with you. We'll go together. So we have that. Patients are responding to that. But then more importantly, we launch ad hoc surveys to our constituencies. We've done one on breast cancer. We've done one on immuno-oncology. I just recently did one for a large U.S. retailer who said, well, what do you think patients need? And I said, don't ask me. Let's ask the people, right? So we launched just a 20-question survey out. The smallest number of responses we've had to any of those surveys was 1,100 in 24 hours. Okay, that's the smallest number. And the reason it stopped at 1,100 in 24 hours is because I shut it down. We don't need any more data. This is enough to help us make the decision. The ones on immuno-oncology and breast cancer, by the time we shut that down in just a few days, we were topping 2,000 patients answering these surveys, okay? The one that I did shut down that was only 20 questions, I got 3 phone calls from people who said were angry with me because I didn't ask them enough questions. They said, my experience is more than what you've just asked in those 20 questions, right? I need to add a little bit more to that. And I said, are you in the registry? No, they had found us through social media channels. I said, please go there, right, and complete those questions. So, it's easy for us to sort of stop and say, well, I wouldn't do it, or, but patients are doing it, and we have the data. And I'll just leave. We're getting ready to launch an access question survey, Len, so I'll come back to you on this, where we're trying to understand patients in the marketplaces and out of the marketplaces. What is their access to care today versus what it was last year? 35 questions, so we'll update you shortly.
Let me take us in a different direction. A patient walks into the doctor's office. The doctor says, you have cancer, and then starts to explain what it is and what can be done. The patient is turned off. They're psychologically thinking, I'm going to die. And so they have not heard the explanation. They have not heard the treatment and so forth, because they're now thinking, how do I tell my wife, or how do I tell my husband, or how do I tell my kids, or who do I talk? And so what is being done for the patient, to empower the patient to really know what was said, what was done, and an ability to also tell other loved ones, decision makers, and so forth, what has been going on. I think that's critical. When I was told I had epilepsy, I didn't know what epilepsy was. My family was against epilepsy because it meant you were possessed by the devil. All these type of things culturally that come into play. So what is being done to help the patient understand what is being said to them so they can take it home, rethink it over and over and over as many times as they want, ask the right questions the next time they go in, so that everybody is empowered in a different and better way?
So I'll start with that. I think there are a lot of things that are ongoing for those type of situations. I know at Duke you're doing a lot of work on risk-benefit, and how do you really teach patients how to understand risk-benefit and make those trade-off decisions, and I applaud you for that. It's impressive work. I think there are two issues. Number one is, how do you teach patients how to become empowered participants? And so we have a number of educational tools, as I know a number of my advocacy colleagues in the audience do as well. We've got a treatment decision counseling model that's based on the research that we've done to help patients deliver and engage in those kind of conversations. I think that there's really another component of this, and it's the physician communication piece of it. And so we are really trying to work with professional societies to say, how do we bring these together, right? Because what you think you might be saying is not, in fact, what patients hear. And, we have study after study who demonstrate that patients with metastatic breast cancer in particular will have a full conversation with their physician where the physician is feeling like they're giving them really that full and accurate picture, and the patients will walk away and say, oh, I'm being treated. There's a chance that I'll be cured. Right? So it's not just what we're teaching physicians, it's not just what we're teaching patients, but it's how are we teaching them to engage in this collective process that will help remedy that.
Amy?
I'm going to add a little bit more color to a couple of things that Linda just said that are very important. The first is that as clinical trialists, and when we're doing research, we actually need to be planning what's the shared decision-making discussion at the time of interpreting the results and preparing to present the results. We recently presented a paper at ASCO looking at continuing versus discontinuing statins in the end-of-life setting. And really the results that we found implied that there needed to be a shared decision between doctors and patients about how to actually make sense of these data. And in fact, really what we needed to do was also provide the framework for doctors and patients to talk together. And that actually needed to be a part of the evidence development and implementation process. So one is that the idea that we have this discussion needs to be planned into our innovation cycle, and we actually need to think about what that looks like. The second, it goes back to what Len said around really being very thoughtful about doctor-patient communication and how we learn how to have these discussions with patients. As you said, people are overwhelmed and they shut off in listening.
They're also fearful. And they put the doctor on a pedestal, and they think, I can't ask them a stupid question, which they need to ask all the questions. But go ahead, Amy.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And the other thing is that it's the circle of love, right? It's more than just two people together. It's actually the circle of love that sits around you. Sometimes you've got caregivers and other people in the room who are hearing and trying to interpret. But otherwise, you're talking to people on the phone once you've gotten home and trying to remember that. And so really practicing all of those important steps of healthy communication is a key piece of making sure that we keep patients.
Is there a vehicle for that?
So in oncology, we have something called OncoTalk, which is actually a training program for oncologists to teach them better delivery of bad news, actually how to do personal self-care as oncologists in order to make sure that we take care of ourselves in order to be a part of this conversation. And I think that that's been an important innovation in the oncology community, is to say, how do we take evidence-based best practices and now develop them into a whole-scale evidence-based model that can be taught. And then I think the third part is that we're seeing actually how information technology can be built into a supporting under infrastructure and not take the place of doctor-patient communication, but that doctors and patients can use that effectively as a part of the communication stream. And what we need to do is teach ourselves not to use IT as the crutch, but actually to use it as part of making the process a bit easier.
One of the
Tony,
go ahead.
I'm sitting here and I said, you asked a softball question and I've got to have a chance to get a hit.
Right?
Because my colleagues there are a number of organizations sitting here in this room that have devoted substantial resources to trying to provide patient education and patient service. And Linda's organization, Cancer Care, Trish Golden's here, will be speaking later, But clearly the American Cancer Society has spent a tremendous amount of effort providing information, providing resources, providing a call center that is readily available at 800-ACS-2345 to have people who are trained knowledgeable 24/7 to be able to address the very issue that you're talking about. So I think it's core to the principles of a number of organizations to say exactly what someone has said, you have cancer, they do turn off. We obviously recommend that someone else go, just simply as a matter for information purposes, something as simple as that. We've also been very supportive, as Amy mentioned, OncoTalk. You got that in before I had a chance, because we've actually funded and helped direct the pilots of OncoTalk around the country. They've been very positively received by the oncologists who have been trained. And Amy mentioned one aspect of health information technology, but to try to help patients to get through the burden, I think we also have to remember that a lot of things happen in that first period of time. I mean, there was some research recently reported on double mastectomies in the United States. And there was an incredibly thoughtful and well done editorial by Lisa Newman, who's a surgeon at the University of Michigan, talking about what needs to happen for women who are told they have breast cancer from the time that they're given that diagnosis until they make the decision for their treatment perhaps several weeks later, seeing a number of physicians usually who are going to give them perhaps a different take. And she, at the conclusion of her editorial, she made the comment that it is so critical that women seek access to the information that's available to them, not to say what decision they should make. Some of us have a sense of what the decision should be, but that's not important. It's what the patient thinks is important. But they take that opportunity to be educated through every possible means. We hope the medical community is providing that education. I have to say, we don't have the data to say what's really going on in real life. The concern some of us has is that education is not always as free of bias, shall we say, as objective as it could be. And there are tools and opportunities to tell people. That study, by the way, showed that there was no survival advantage of double mastectomy for a woman with primary breast cancer over lumpectomy and radiation therapy. They would not live longer, live better, or whatever as a result. Whether that's going to be used as an example, I would say, is that going to be used as part of the evidence discussion by people who have other interests in treatments remains to be seen.
As a patient, what I've heard from boards that I've served on, people I've dealt with, and I'm an active advocate, so that might be a little different. But I've heard a lot that from researchers, in particular research hospitals, people involved with research hospitals, is we know best. And your doctor and you as a patient may not know. And some of that research is put out in a way that doctors have told me they don't even understand it, let alone the patient understanding it. Is that a real problem? And how do we solve that? How do we convince researchers that they have an obligation to not only do the research, but to communicate it in a way that everybody can understand what the heck you're trying to say or do? Glenn?
I'm thinking as you're talking, because we're here at Turning the Tide, we're talking about precision personalized medicine. And one of the issues that I think is facing the medical community going forward is the complexity of genomics research, the rapidity of advances in genomics research, and the implications for patients and the typical practicing oncologist, that practicing physician. It is a huge need and a huge demand. And I will tell you, as a personal anecdote, I get asked to digest a lot of medical information for the media. Whatever. I've been doing it for a long time. I can pick out the key phrases. I'll tell you, the genomic stuff has almost stumped me, because I read these incredibly complicated, terrific pieces of research that show up, and I'm looking for the nuggets. I'm looking for the nuggets. So the real question you're asking is, how do you translate the nuggets? We are going to face a huge challenge, and I think most of us have heard this again repeatedly, of taking this rapidly and incredibly important, incredibly valuable tool and trying to separate the chaff from the wheat and so forth, and the noise, to get to the kernels and be able to explain it to even people who have an interest in this. And that's going to be a challenge. That's a challenge on the table today as we speak. because the researchers talk in languages and they publish in languages that, okay, I am a little bit older, but I think even younger physicians and pretty smart young people who are not directly involved are going to have trouble. And I don't know what Linda's experience, Paul, but Amy obviously has had a foot in this camp for a long time, and it's a huge challenge.
Amy?
One of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is, just like we talk about learning health systems in terms of the system is continuously and iteratively learning, part of that learning process is watching how we communicate the data about the research that's coming out, and then understanding how that information is being taken up and put into practice. I think we have to systematically monitor that and optimize the communication function as well. So we've been trying to think about how do you build overarching systems where the clinical trials function is directly partnered with, for example, the professional body and communication function, and is directly partnered then with the quality monitoring and monitoring of implementation, the community function, so that you can make sure that that cycle actually works.
Linda?
I think it's a real challenge, and I think that there may be this element of, if you embed real patients, and I always say real patients, not me, right? Not professional patients, but embed real patients into that process. You learn a lot about what about this doesn't make sense to you. One of the first things we did with the Access study is take it to patients, because it was such high-level language around insurance coverage. So we took it to our affiliates and reached out to patients and said, what about this doesn't make sense to you, before we launch a broad survey. So there is that element that I think if we could have somebody sitting there to say, I have no idea what that means, right? Even as you explain it, this is where I still am a little fuzzy on it, will help us at least advance that, instead of creating it and launching it.
Paul, any comment?
I would just say that this is like a societal problem we have right now. This is data versus information. We have a lot of data floating around that is in many ways not very practical and not very informative, which kind of goes back to my PRO point of if we can find a way to make the data more informative to make decisions, that's all I'm going after.
Let me ask you a question on that. So the data is there, I agree with you. Who pays for the data, and why can't we sort of say, well, if the data can't be understood and so forth, it's of no value? So
no, I think it could be of value. It's just that the academics and others interested in asking questions can utilize that data to interpret it. And then as far as communicating, which I think is a really interesting question, what FDA speaks in its own language, like lawyers speak in its own language, and doctors speak in their own language. And so when we make a regulatory decision,
politicians don't, by the way, but
right, but that's what you're so good at. So when we go to the AACR, or we go to the ASCO, or we go to any of these meetings to discuss breakthrough therapy or to discuss new policy on oncology drug approval, we're talking about reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, due diligence, all these regulatory terms. And so what we then end up being able to do is to say, well, this is what it practically means for you guys with respect to clinical trials. So we have used these forums to try to communicate what does this actually mean. And there's not as much forum for patients having researchers talk about their findings, although that'll have to be selective because there's so much research coming out. But if it's a really hot topic like genetics and tumor genotyping, and you get 200 different mutations, and the patients are going, oh my God, I've got 200 mutations. What does that mean to them? Maybe having some kind of conference where patients there was a lot of patients in there, because I know many academics can really explain it well. It's just they haven't had much of a
We have to
forum
leave 15 minutes for audience participation, which I really am big on making happen. But we have about 2 minutes before we get there. So I'd like to ask a different question. A lot of the discussion this morning was about the cost of health care and what it means to individuals. And employers paying for it, and we're all paying for it, those comments. With technology today and the digital age and so forth, are we getting to a point, this is a little bit loaded, are we getting to a point where you need to do something about cost containment? And we as patients are very concerned about one size fits all. I take a particular drug for my seizures that is not commonly used. But if we go one size fits all, obviously that drug is going to be eliminated. So from a patient point of view, we love the new data that's coming out. We love the new information and all that stuff. But where are we going? Is it in regards to costs? And Linda, why don't you start?
Jen Malin and I have had this conversation before, and we know from our value work that patients say, look, what's really valuable to me is that I have time with my healthcare team to fully understand the benefit-risk profile so that I can make an educated decision. I believe that we can bend this cost curve if we in fact do that. So let's pay doctors to have those conversations or nurses to have those conversations with patients rather than giving patients therapy, expensive therapies, in their final hours of life. There's study after study after study to demonstrate that the biggest cost comes at the end of life. So if we do appropriate care planning from the point of diagnosis, if we have those conversations to better understand what it is with patients, there is not anyone in this room or anyone that I know of who says that we want to give the wrong drug to the wrong patient at precisely the wrong time. And that's something that we can, that's something that we could prevent by having different levels.
Amy, short comment, and then I want Lynn.
So two comments. One is that we know that when we talk to patients about their goals of care, we can actually better align what it is that we're providing them. And patients do want to talk about their goals. And the thing that we've learned in palliative care is that when we talk to administrators, it should be about cost, but when we actually talk to patients and societies, palliative care should not be about cost. It's really about aligning of goals and care. The other thing that I'd just like to comment on is that, I practiced in Australia for 4 years, where I was struck by the fact that it was a societal discussion of things have been good for me and now I don't need any further intervention for where I am in my life and what's going on with my disease. And that's not a part of where we are in society. And so until that's a comfortable discussion for us to all have, it becomes very hard for us to get our head around something's being taken away from me. And so we're going to have to work our way through that.
Lynn, you have
10 seconds. I sit on a committee that does advises Medicare on terms of physician payment. I've been on that for 22 years. One of the recommendations coming out of the policy paper is that we have more codes to pay for more things. And I think it's reductio ad absurdum. I think it's going to be a pretty difficult sell. I don't know what the new payments miles are going to be, but taking things away, the insurers, as we all know, have gone to narrow networks, we still don't know the impact of that in terms of cancer care and making choices. But then we also have the question of, I want that drug, as you mentioned specifically in your situation. We're seeing situations now where a genetic analysis will say there's this mutation in this particular disease where we would not have expected it, and there's a drug over here that may be effective against that. Are we going to pay for that or not pay for that? And I think that the ASCO has put together this basically a coverage with evidence proposal. I think we need to move to an evidence-based accrual of information along the lines of what we've been saying, so we get past to some of that. But I have to say, I live in fear. And I got to tell you this, I'm concerned about it. I live in fear about the cost of medicine. I live in fear about the financial engineering that are done by many different parts of the system, whether it be hospitals or others or doctors. When I see these new codes come through, and I just don't know, having been there, we need some new thinking, because I got to tell you, I'm worn out. And I don't mean me, a lot of us are worn out trying to figure out how can we make sure that the right conversations are held, that the right tests are done, that we have sufficient resources within the system to provide the care we need to provide, and do it in a way that our constituents, our patients, our population don't think that we're trying to hold something back. It's a very difficult conversation.
Thank you, Lynn. Paul, you have maybe 10 seconds to conclude this panel.
One breath.
Talk fast.
Predictive biomarkers. That's one way that we can right away figure out how to decrease costs and select the correct patients, both positive predictive markers and with respect to KRAS and other mutations that we know that this therapy is not going to work in. We can really save a lot of patients from tons of toxicity with no efficacy.
All right, let's open up to questions from the audience. Anybody have a question? Somebody way in the back there. They're coming to you with a mic. There you are.
I have a loud voice, but not that loud. Michael Sagaller from Conafe Group. So we have a number of people we work with at research institutes and companies that deal with pediatric cancers. So when you do not have the patient filling out, the questionnaires and this type of ongoing information, when you have a caregiver doing it, does it create so many additional variables as to make the situation problematic, or is that an area that you're addressing as well?
We have a guidance that was written in 2009 called the Patient-Reported Outcomes Guidance for Industry that would be suitable for labeling in the FDA label, which is a very rigorous guidance, and it's certainly for the perfect instrument. We recognize there has to be flexibility exerted with respect to this guidance, but it does speak to and a new COA guidance, a clinical outcomes assessment guidance, that broadens our perspective on what are patient-reported outcomes. Because it's not only children, it could be patients that have brain tumors or some other patient group who simply can't report for themselves. We recognize that's a need, and so these observational reported outcomes, they have limitations. If I can make any point, it's that all of these things are going to have some limitations, but you can find ways to optimize the instrument, optimize the trial design, optimize the collection, decrease the missing data, and that's the best you can do, mitigate the limitations, and then see what you got.
Thank you. I wanted to bring up, we ran out of time, about people with disabilities who also end up with cancer like anybody else, and the problems there, but we don't have the time right now. Go ahead.
I'm Lakshman Ramamurthy, Ravalier Health, former FDA reviewer and diagnostics at CTRH. I had a two-part question. The first one is actually on the issue that you just brought up, Dr. Klutz, on the FDA guidance. You know, almost every FDA advisory panel I've been to, when I was at the FDA or after, the same joke is repeated, saying, but really, who reads the label, right? So, and of course, companies oftentimes, in their quest to seek approval, will allow for some mitigations, limitations to be buried in the label somewhere, knowing that it gets them out in the market. So that's a point I'd like you to address. But I have a Part B question that's somewhat different for a commentary for more generally. There's an article today in New York Times about a lady who has specifically identified when she wants to die. She has a cancer. And then there was an article by Zeke Emanuel a few weeks ago and saying, I do not want to live past 75. Since your last conversation was along those lines, I'd love for your input on that. Thank you.
Go ahead.
You want to start with the label? Okay. All right. Now, I will tell you, as a still practicing physician, you know, when I was a resident and when I was even an oncology fellow, I didn't read the label. I read up to date. It's too busy, too much going on. The FDA label is really a wealth of information, and it's an excellent, scientifically very tight thing to read. But I'm not here to market the label. Who cares about the label are lawyers and industry. Why do they care about the labels? Because they can market their drug based on what is in the FDA label. Why does that matter to me? Because for a company to make a marketing labeling claim, they need to provide us with substantial evidence that the claim is not false or misleading. Why does that matter to patients? Because you don't want someone to say, my drug improves quality of life, and have millions of patients making decisions based on that data if the data is not reliable.
Glenn?
I'm going to, you know, I don't want to tackle Dr. Emanuel. For those of you who didn't read the article, basically the precept was, I don't want any treatment provided to me outside past of 75, and whatever's going to happen to me is going to happen to me, that my life, basically my productive life is over as I see it. I will only say, from a global position, he's entitled to his opinion. There are a lot of people who don't feel that way. During the ACA campaign, I was actually in the East Room, or one of those rooms, and the president was asked that question by a young lady. My grandmother's 85 years old. Is the Affordable Care Act going to mean that and she's fully functional, fully capable, and doing everything she wants to do? And I think the right answer is what we've talked about up here. We need to have a culture that encourages discussions about values and principles that are right for individuals, respect those individual principles and rights, and abide by them as a medical system, as opposed to shoving everybody down a chute and making everybody go to the same place. So I think it's a larger, if it stimulates that conversation, we have that. In closing, at ASCO, another blog that I wrote was about a picture at ASCO of a 96-year-old lady in a phase 1 clinical trial with a head and neck cancer. It was the last session of the last day at ASCO, and it showed this large neck mass that shrunk down to nothing. But the key part of that slide wasn't that not only the mass shrunk down, the little Mona Lisa smile on her face, which really said so much. 96 years old, phase 1 trial with a good result at that time. That was a decision that was made by a number of people. I will tell you that 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, that probably never would have happened by age alone. Phase 1 clinical trial. So let's embrace, we talk about embracing diversity. Let's embrace diversity within our population of the people we care for, who entrust their lives to us, to meet all of as many of the expectations as we can, both those who choose not to receive treatment and those who are fully educated and informed who decide to take a course that may be better for them. There will inevitably have to be restrictions at some point. We can't do everything for everyone, but at least let's have those conversations and have them honestly and reasonably with the support of all the wonderful people on this panel, the people who are here in this audience, to help encourage that process that's so necessary in our healthcare system in this country.
All right. Why don't all of you give a great hand to a great panel and their discussion? Appreciate it very much.